They said the door was never meant to open. Not to the cellar, but to something deeper. Something beneath the cellar. Beneath the soil, beneath reason itself. The first thing the sheriff remembered, when they forced it open 40 years later, was the smell, not of rot, but of something older, sweeter, like the breath from a mouth that had forgotten daylight. And when the boards split and the rusted hinges failed, his lantern revealed shapes that were not corpses and not living either, huddled against the wet stone walls like roots that refused to die. The eldest one turned toward the light not with fear, but with a hunger the living shouldn't have. It blinked as if the air burned its eyes. Someone screamed that these weren't people anymore, and someone else whispered that they were, and that was worse. No one spoke of the scratches carved into the rock, dozens of them, tally marks, circles, spirals, the desperate mathematics of time. 40 winters spent in the womb of earth, 40 summers without sky. The sheriff dropped his lantern when he saw the smallest of them, curled like an animal against a bed of straw, hair matted with dirt, bones visible beneath skin, so pale it looked carved from candle wax. And when the light flickered across its face, it smiled. A broken smile. The kind a child shouldn't learn without sunlight or touch. Tell me something quietly. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because the archives don't name this land anymore. The mapmakers erased it before the century turned. But if you walk northward, hugging the dry riverbed, you may still find the ruins of a farmhouse, swallowed by vines and blackened by forgotten fire. It stood in a county that never made the newspapers, bordered by soil rich with bones of buffalo and men. Locals called it Hollowfield, not because the fields were empty, but because the land beneath them was hollow. They said the farmers could hear echoes under the plow, like something shifting, waiting. They built homes atop silence, and prayed that silence was enough. In the winter of 1921, when the frost refused to melt, the founder of that house, Abraham Corwin, vanished from the church registry. Not died, not moved, vanished. His wife, Ilara, was seen only once more, carrying sacks of grain down to the cellar. After that, the windows stayed dark. The neighbors thought the Corwins had run away or fallen ill. But they hadn't left. They simply chose darkness over daylight, secrecy over shame, and they took their children with them, and their children's children. Because someone once said that the light carries memories, and if you fear memory, you run from light. And for the Corwins, memory was poison. It was blood laid over blood, generation upon generation, folding in on itself like a bruise that never heals. Abram Corwin's neighbors did not see him again after that winter, but they heard things, soft thuds beneath the soil, as though steps were taken on stone where no stone existed. It was the pastor who first went to the farmhouse door, calling out scripture as if it could reach the dark. No answer, only silence. And silence in Hollowfield was never empty. It was thick, patient, breathing. The pastor backed away, crossing himself in a rushed, trembling motion, teaching his congregation that some absences are not meant to be questioned. But a child was born down there. The townsfolk would not know this for decades, but in 1923, a cry echoed in that abyss, muffled like a voice pressed through hands too weak to scream. No one marked the birth. No baptism, no registry, no prayer. The boy was called Sul, not because they honored the sun, but because Abram believed names should carry irony. He was the son that would never see daylight. He grew on grain and root vegetables, on the damp mildew that clung to the walls like settling dust. He never walked upright. He shuffled, stooped as if the ceiling itself held him down. A child meant to breathe the sky was raised instead on stone. The others, Abram, Elora, and the girl they brought down with them, began to change. Their voices deepened as if their throats had grown coated in earth. Their skin cracked, pale and waxy. But Sol laughed. Sol whispered. Sol learned to carve symbols in stone. He drew faces that did not belong to the family. Faces of people who died long before he was born. He murmured names that did not come from the Corwins' tongues. He pressed his ear against the rock and told Elara that the earth spoke to him. Slow, rumbling words older than any sermon the pastor had ever uttered. Abram tried to silence the boy, but every attempt only grew the child's fascination. Sol was not afraid of the dark. He called it Mother. And when Sol turned 11, something changed. He began to appear more like Abram than like the child Elara had carried. His eyes mirrored the father's, his posture, his voice. It was as if the cave had reshaped the boy into a mirror, a reflection of the man standing before him. The girl, younger, watched these changes with terror. She would sleep pressed against the dirt, as though wishing it would swallow her. She often woke shaking, whispering that the walls moved in the night. Sol began asking questions no child should ask. About lineage, about blood, about whether parents could be children of their own ancestors. Abram struck him once, only once, but the stone floor cracked where Sol fell. The crack spread like a mouth opening. Elara screamed. Abram backed away, trembling, realizing the boy had never truly belonged to them. The earth had claimed him long ago. The cave beneath the farmhouse never stopped changing. What Abram had once dug as a root cellar warped into chambers that felt carved by something with intention, not shovels. The walls dripped with condensation that tasted like copper, and the air grew heavy with a sweetness that reminded Elara of blood. Sol's carvings multiplied. Spirals, faces, runes, shapes that resembled twisted branches, but no branch had ever sprouted eyes. The girl, Mara, dared not look at them. Yet she could not escape their presence. Even when she shut her eyes, she saw them traced across her eyelids like dark veins. Time meant nothing down there. Days and nights blended into one colorless continuum. Food was rationed until Abram realized it hardly mattered. The children ate less than they should have, and still they grew. They grew in ways that did not respect the laws of bodies, gaining height in spurts, shoulders broadening overnight, tendons tightening like coiled rope. Elara often woke to find Sol sitting cross-legged, palms pressed against the wall. As if listening for a heartbeat inside the stone, he would murmur things she could not hear. Old words, not English. Not any language she knew. It made her shiver, but she dared not interrupt him. By the time Sol reached his 14th year, he was too intelligent for a child who had never seen sky or books. He spoke as though he remembered things he had never lived. Abram avoided him, fearing whatever had shaped the boy. Elara watched, helpless. Realizing the boy's voice had begun to resemble hers when she was young, Mara shook constantly now, as if her nerves had become exposed wires. Sol asked about mothers and fathers. He asked where Abram came from. He asked questions about lineages and bloodlines that no child should construct without context or knowledge. Abram tried to answer, but every word sounded hollow. Sol laughed at the hollowness, softly, almost lovingly, as if mocking the fragility of human lineage itself. One night, Mara found Sol tracing his hand along the carvings, whispering something to the cave. He told her the earth had a memory, and that memory was leaking into his. He told her secrets about their parents she had never imagined. He told her that the people above ground were not like them, that their blood was straight, not curved, that in their bloodlines, time stretched outward like branches. But in the Corwin blood, time curled inward like a coil, winding tighter and tighter. Abram tried to drag Sol away from the wall, but the boy did not flinch. He stared at Abram with a strange tenderness, as if pitying him. Abram struck Sol again, but this time the blow never landed. Sol caught Abram's wrist, calmly, gently, like a parent restraining a frightened child. Abram froze, realizing the truth. Sol had become older than him, not in years, but in something deeper, something marrow deep, something inherited or stolen from the earth itself. Elara had always been gentle, but in the dark her edges sharpened. Something in the air, something in the steady drip of distant water, had dulled her fear and replaced it with a quiet acceptance. She began to see Sol not as her son, but as something inevitable, something the Corwin blood had been crawling toward for generations. She felt a strange reverence when she watched him, as though gazing at an ancient idol rather than a child she had birthed in damp straw. Mara saw it too, though she wished she didn't. She slept curled against her mother's side, trembling when Sol walked past, shoulders brushing the low ceiling. Sol would stare at her sometimes, not maliciously, but with a curiosity that made Mara feel like she was being measured, weighed, evaluated. She tried to disappear into shadows, but the cave had no shadows. The lanterns flickered too softly. The darkness pressed too close. Everything was exposed. Abram aged rapidly. His skin thinned, hair whitening, eyes hollowing. He would cough for hours, leaning against the stone. Sol did not offer comfort, not hatred, not warmth, only observation. As though Abram's decay was part of a timeline Sol already understood. Abram begged Elara to leave with him, to take the children and run. But the staircase above them had collapsed long ago. The boards had rotted, dust choking the air. There was no exit anymore. The earth had swallowed them, and the earth did not give back what it claimed. Elara, in her weary calm, began telling Sol stories. Family stories, ones her grandmother had whispered when she was small. She spoke of cousins who married cousins, of bloodlines that knotted upon themselves in old villages where the nearest stranger lived miles away. She spoke of shame hidden under rugs, of babies born with the wrong features, of funerals held in barns to avoid church gossip. She spoke because she thought Sol deserved truth. But Sol listened as though he already knew. Mara listened too, and her tears wet the stone. She cried not because the truth was ugly, but because it felt inevitable. She felt the weight of lineage pressing against her spine, like a hand guiding her toward a fate she didn't choose. She pressed her fingers into the dirt beneath her, whispering prayers she barely remembered. But prayers cannot fight blood. Sol's voice deepened, not loud, not angry, deep like something spoken inside one's bones. He asked Elara who her parents truly were, who Abram's parents truly were. Elara hesitated before speaking, then whispered that she and Abram shared a grandfather. One man, two lines, branching inward, curling inward, returning inward. Mara's breath shattered as she heard it. Her parents were cousins before they were lovers, kin before they were spouse, and she understood suddenly why the cave felt like destiny. Abram sobbed, as though part of him had always known this, but denial had shielded him. Elara held him, not as a wife but as kin. And Sol stared at them with those ancient, touched eyes. Eyes that saw patterns in blood, the way others see constellations in sky. Because now the truth had been spoken aloud. The Corwin tree had not grown, it had folded. And something in that fold had awoken. After the truth spilled into the damp air, something shifted in Sol's posture. He stood straighter, like the weight of the secret had been lifted from him rather than laid upon him. Mara recoiled, pressing her back against the rough stone, scraping skin until blood streaked her nightdress. She stared at Sol as though he were less brother than omen, a prophecy incarnate. Elora whispered prayers into her palms, words fractured and half-remembered. Abram crawled closer to his daughter, as though shielding her from the son who no longer seemed human in any sense they recognized. But Sol whispered something back. To the walls, to the earth, to whatever intelligence had gnawed its way into his blood. The cave answered with a low groan, as though its veins shifted, as though something deeper stirred. Mara screamed, but the sound died quickly, smothered by the heavy air. Abram tried to hold her, but his arms trembled, brittle as dying branches. Sol turned slowly, deliberately, and stared at Elora. His voice was gentle when he spoke, but it sounded ancient, as though borrowed through generations. "You knew," he murmured. "You always knew." Elora shook, tears falling silently. She had not known consciously, but something in her marrow had whispered the truth long before she could bear to hear it. Sol did not blame her. He only observed. The way a reader observes a book they have read 1,000 times. The carvings on the walls began to darken, as though absorbing the lantern's flicker. Spirals and faces twisted, shifting like muscles under skin. Abram gasped, clutching his chest as though struck. He fell forward, face pressed against the stone, mouth opening and closing without words. Mara cried his name, but Sol stepped closer. Kneeling beside the dying man, he placed his hand on Abram's shoulder, not harshly, but with a strange tenderness. His touch was not love, but recognition, a farewell between two beings whose blood had entangled in a manner no lineage should ever know. Sol whispered, not a question, not a plea, a statement of biology and tragedy. Abram's breath rattled, then stilled. Elora choked on her tears, pulling Mara close, shielding her eyes. But Mara could not look away. She stared at Sol, at the stillness in his expression, at the lack of horror, at the calm acceptance that something larger than grief had unfolded. He stood slowly, looking not at Abram's corpse, but at the spiral of carvings behind him. "This is the place," Sol said. "The blood brought us here. We are not the first." Elora shook her head, but in her silence lay admission. Mara whimpered, clutching her mother's dress, knowing that the cave had become more than prison. It had become inheritance. Sol placed his palm against the spirals, and the stone felt warm. The warmth spread through the chamber, raising the hairs along Mara's arms. She could feel something waiting beneath her feet, beneath the bones of the floor, beneath memory itself. And then Sol turned to her, his sister, his cousin, his mirror in the coil of lineage, and stared with eyes not born from innocence, but from generations compressed into one. There was no escape now, not for the living, not for memory, not for blood. The farmhouse above remained silent for decades, as if nothing had ever stirred beneath its rotting beams. Outside, Hollowfield's winds swept through empty fields, carrying whispers that no one living could decipher. But below, in the stone womb, life persisted in a form that was neither natural nor fully human. Sol walked the passages that Abram had once dug, tracing the spirals, counting the faces, listening to the echoes of centuries folded inward. Mara and Elora followed silently, their footsteps light against stone worn smooth by generations of hands. By the late 1940s, the cave had expanded in ways Abram could not have foreseen. Walls arched, new chambers appeared where none had been before, The air grew thick with a metallic scent, and every breath felt like inhaling history itself. Sol had begun leaving marks, messages carved in a cipher only he seemed to understand. Sometimes he hummed low tunes that vibrated through the rock, carrying a resonance that made Mora's teeth chatter and Elara's vision blur. The child's voice, once fragile, now bore the weight of ages, rolling off the walls like incantations meant for ears that no longer existed above ground. In the evenings, Mora would sit by the corner of one chamber, watching Sol speak to shapes invisible to anyone else. The shadows responded, stretching and twisting as if they were alive. Rats, birds, even snakes, animals that Abram had dragged down for food, seemed to recognize the boy. Some would freeze, their eyes glinting with an intelligence no human could claim. Elara began to understand that this was not the boy they had raised. Sol was something else entirely. Something the earth had sculpted from their sins, their secrecy, their blood. When Sol reached 17, his body was no longer that of a boy. His limbs were too long, his voice too deep. Yet he retained the childlike precision in his movements. He carried the weight of all the Corwins who had come before him, a living archive of transgressions, whispered horrors, and unspoken desires. Mora noticed that he sometimes spoke of events that predated her existence, of births and deaths, long before the first floorboard of their farmhouse rotted. Elara began to fear that if the boy, now more man than child, ever left the cave, the world above would collapse under the revelation of what the Corwins truly were. And then came the night the strange visitors arrived. They appeared not at the door, but in the earth itself, pressing against walls so thin they seemed transparent. Shadows that were not human crept along the stone, their movements deliberate, observing. Sol welcomed them as if greeting old friends. Mara shivered, clinging to her mother, realizing that the world above had no idea of the covenant that existed below. There was a ritual, silent but immense, conducted in the language of bone and dirt, of blood and memory. The walls themselves seemed to breathe. The carvings expanded, faces multiplying, eyes opening in stone to watch the participants. Sol, Elara, and Mara, though terrified, entranced, took their place, and for the first time, Mara understood that the lineage of the Corwins had never belonged to the surface world at all. It belonged to the hollow, to the earth, to the darkness that swallowed light, and grew stronger with every secret kept. The town above knew nothing of the chambered earth beneath their feet, but they sensed a wrongness that could not be named. Livestock vanished, fields refused to yield. Children spoke of seeing eyes in the wind. Hollowfield whispered its fears, but no one listened until the fire came. It began with a smell, acrid, burning, familiar, as if the land itself were wincing. Smoke curled over the empty fields, carrying with it the scent of old blood, of memories scorched from the earth. A farmer passing the Corwin farmhouse saw the blaze first. Flames licked the windows, thick black smoke pouring from every crevice. He ran toward it, screaming, only to find the boards at the front splintered and the door half buried in dirt, charred black. He called the neighbors. Soon, a small crowd gathered. No one dared enter, and yet the screams, muffled, human yet wrong, reached their ears. They said the sounds were children, but no child could produce such a tone, part anguish, part ritual, part something older. The townsfolk acted collectively, violently. They tore through the remaining farmhouse, smashing furniture, dragging animals into the mud and tossing them into the fire. Bibles were thrown into flames alongside family records. The local priest muttered verses meant to cleanse, but the smoke swallowed him before he could finish. Nothing could erase what had fermented below for 40 years. The Corwins, wherever they had been, were already beyond reach. Yet the aftermath left a scar deeper than fire or mud. Hollowfield's children began whispering about the Corwins' shadows. The adults spoke of madness creeping along the soil. Even decades later, townspeople swore they could hear murmurs beneath the plow, the scratching of nails against stone. And in the ruins, a few brave souls dared to dig, hoping to find closure. They found only soil compacted unnaturally, with tunnels leading deeper than any human hand could have carved. Mara and Elara survived the fire by retreating farther into the earth. Sol led them through passages Abraham had not known, corridors lined with carved spirals and faces that glimmered faintly in the firelight filtering through cracks. The flames above were distant music. The cave beneath was life itself, relentless and aware. Sol whispered to them that the surface world had tried to destroy the lineage. But the lineage was older than flame, older than shame, older than any laws men could make. Elara wept quietly, pressing her palm into the cool stone. Mara, exhausted and trembling, leaned against her brother. She could feel the earth beneath them pulse, as if acknowledging their survival. It was not a home they had escaped to. It was a cradle, a tomb, a cathedral for the twisted architecture of their blood. Sol traced the carvings once more, his fingers leaving impressions that glowed faintly, as if blood itself were writing. And for the first time in decades, the three of them were alone. No footsteps, no whispers from the surface, no authority, no judgment, only the weight of inheritance, the fold of generations compressed into flesh and bone, and the hollow beneath the farmhouse waiting. By the 1980s, traces of the Corwin family had begun surfacing in the hands of the curious and the unknowing. A researcher, a genealogist drawn to forgotten towns, stumbled across photographs in the county archives of farmhouse, blackened by fire. Children with faces too pale, too angular, eyes unnaturally reflective. There were letters, yellowed and brittle, from neighbors recalling strange noises, impossible shapes glimpsed through windows, and a child who spoke like a man long before age permitted. The researcher traced names, dates, whispers of disappearances, and found the faintest trail of the Corwin bloodline. He visited Hollowfield under the guise of mapping forgotten cemeteries. The land was quiet, but it throbbed beneath his feet, as if resisting his intrusion. He noticed depressions in fields, soil slightly darker than the rest, depressions that suggested something hollow beneath. He catalogued the records, the letters, the fire reports, the oral testimonies of villagers who refused to speak directly about the Corwins. Every account hinted at horror, yet no one could articulate the full story, only fragments. Like shards of a mirror, reflecting something they were terrified to name. The researcher found a photograph that froze his blood, a young boy, pale and delicate, standing with two women in a cellar, the walls behind them covered in spirals and carvings. The boy's eyes, black, reflective, knowing, seemed to see past the photograph, into the room, into the researcher's own past. He noticed similarities in family features, not just with the written records, but with people alive decades later. DNA records confirmed an impossible knot, lines looping inward, blood folded upon itself. Cousins, siblings, parents all compressed into a single, repeating coil. He returned to the farmhouse ruins alone and descended as far as the crumbling structure would allow. There, in the half-buried cellar, he found remnants of carvings, symbols half erased by fire and time, yet still whispering to him. He could feel something beneath his feet, the hollow, infinite, unbroken by human comprehension. It pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and relentless. He realized that the Corwins had never truly left. They had become part of the earth, part of the darkness between roots, part of the memory of blood and sin that no fire could consume. He recorded his findings meticulously, but he feared them. He left Hollowfield quietly, leaving the land undisturbed. Yet sometimes, he swore he could hear faint laughter carried on the wind. A child's laugh folded into something much older, and in that laughter, he recognized the echo of soul. The lineage persisted, beyond surface, beyond fire, beyond shame. And though decades had passed, the researcher knew some truths were not meant to be unearthed. Some families were not meant to be remembered, and some earth held its secrets so tightly that even light dared not enter. The researcher left Hollowfield, but Hollowfield did not leave him. At night, in hotel rooms or rented apartments far from the ruined farmhouse, he would awaken to the sound of breathing beneath the floorboards. Sometimes he saw shadows in the corner of the ceiling, not cast by anything in the room, but shapes that slithered like smoke, curling into spirals that recalled the carving's soul had traced in stone. His dreams became archives of horrors, whispers of names, sequences of bloodlines folding back upon themselves. A boy with eyes too old for his age, staring through generations. And in those dreams, he asked himself questions that could not be answered without madness. What would you do if the child you loved, the one you swore to protect, carried within them every secret, every crime, every transgression of your ancestors? What would you do if your mother were also your sister, and your father were also your cousin, and the lines of your blood did not merely trace history, but repeated it endlessly, compressing decades into a single breath? Hollowfield remained empty, or so the townsfolk claimed. Travelers passing the fields said they felt watched, though they could see nothing. Farmers who dared plow the soil reported sudden chills, machines stalling, tools breaking for no reason. Children spoke of laughter without source, and the wind sometimes carried words in an ancient tongue. Those who remembered the Corwins spoke in hushed tones, their voices trembling as if the mere mention of the family could awaken something in the hollow beneath. Sol, Ilara, and Mara persisted beneath the farmhouse, folded into the earth itself, living in a rhythm that no calendar could measure. They were older than time, yet younger than it had taught humans to reckon. Generations of secrecy had become a pulse in the rock, a memory in the soil, a consciousness that watched the world above and waited. They were not evil, not in the sense men could comprehend. They were necessary, a lineage that defied law, morality, and mortality. And the researcher, knowing what he had uncovered, could only ask the haunting question one final time, in a whisper that seemed to echo from the stone itself. What would you do if you found out your mother was also your sister? The earth beneath Hollowfield breathed slowly, endlessly. Its pulse carried the Corwin's legacy, a coil folded inward, unbroken by fire, unshaken by time, unrepentant. Outside, the wind carried a faint echo of laughter, of whispers, of a child who had lived 40 years underground. Growing older and wiser in the dark, waiting for the day the world above might finally understand what it had tried to bury, and above all, the hollow remained patient, eternal, listening. THEEND